let's talk a little bit about wavetable synthesis. Over the past couple weeks, like I mentioned, we have been going over subtractive synthesis. We've been going over FM synthesis. And the reason why I've been following this succession is because wavetable synthesis is really, at its core, a longer form version of FM synthesis. You can create most of the sounds that you hear in a wavetable synthesizer utilizing FM synthesis. And most modern wavetable synthesis also incorporates FM synthesis in the process. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of show you the thought process behind doing wavetable synthesis. It's going to sound kind of janky at first. It's not necessarily going to be the most accurate, but once we start moving over to the dedicated wavetable samplers, you'll start to see what I mean. So to do this, first, let's just grab a FM synthesizer. I'm going to use Ableton's built-in FM synth operator. And let's just make, like the most common thing I see wavetable synthesis used for is for kind of like this more aggressive bass music sound design. But we can talk about a couple of other examples there later. But this is, in my opinion, it's the easiest, most viscerally audible form of wavetable synthesis. So I'm just going to put in a long subnote. I'm going to put it in at F0. So let's start adding in a couple of overtones on this. All right, so there were a lot of cool moments on that already, but I want it to start to growl, right? So let's take these oscillator volumes and start mapping them to certain shapes. I'm just gonna have kind of this slanted kind of triangle shape on the top oscillator. And now I'm gonna take this and I'm going to have a sine wave kind of wobble shape on the main oscillator. Let's just see what this sounds like. All right, so I don't think we need the rest of these. I'm just doing that to get the main idea. Now we have this back and forth sort of modulation. Now, if I wanted to do more processing to this, I would have to start loading in all of these plugins. I'd have to start doing a bunch of stuff to it. And that's gonna get kind of CPU intensive, right? Already, we have a little tiny bump from 1 to 5 or 6, so you have about 5% increase. If I start adding on things like a distortion unit to give it a bit more bite, maybe like a redux. And the more I add, the more CPU usage it'll have. But there's an easier way to start to create these. And what if I want to reuse this patch with this automation over and over and over again? Well, instead of keeping it as a MIDI clip, let's freeze this and flatten it down to an audio file. So now I have this patch represented as a waveform, right? Now if I look at this, I can start to see certain patterns emerge. Generally, this opening has this shape, and it quickly starts to morph to this middle shape right here. It gets very dense and high frequency at this moment. It starts to smooth back out. And then we get something that's not quite this shape before we move to almost a pure sine wave. And then we move back and forth. If I loaded this into a new track, like right down here, I have a blank MIDI track. If I load in this sample into an audio sampler and just play a note, we hear it as it was played. As we move up and down the keyboard, we get the different notes playing back as expected, but I want this to be more dynamic. I don't really want to just have the sound playback. I want to be able to move through the different parts. Because like, this is really cool right here. This looks really cool. What if we just want to use that sound? What if we want to have it move up to here and then come back? What if I wanted that? Well, I've already printed this down to audio. I can't go back and change the automation. So what if instead I turn this sampler on to a looping envelope? And let's make the loop length super, super small. I'm going to zoom in to about the length of a single cycle of a wave here. Back. Hear that? If I turn off snapping a little bit, this might make it a bit easier. Ooh, that sounds kind of cool. All right, so let's map the start of this to a macro. So now we could do something like attach an LFO device to this track and route it. Let's make it a little bit slower. Let's just route that to this starting position. Maybe even remove the depth a little bit so it's mostly focused on the beginning of the sample. Now that's kind of cool. At least I think that's pretty cool. We've now started scanning through the different wave cycles of this audio clip that we have to work with. And each one of these is going to have its own particular way of oscillating that's going to be different from playing through the entire patch. This is, in essence, how wavetable synthesis works. This isn't going to be exactly what's happening under the hood. There's a little bit more discrete mathematics going on to convert the information, which I'll show you when we go into some of the more popular wavetable synthesizers. But if you wanted to try and create your own wavetable synthesizer from scratch, this is generally the process that you're going through. You're taking this sample of audio and you're just zooming in and looking at, well, where are these discrete shapes? You can see that this shape right here is pretty much the same as that shape right there. We can sort of see the pulse of the wave cycles. This then becomes a table of wave cycles, a wave table. That's where the name comes from. And by manipulating these tiny chunks, you can have a timbre that rests on a single moment in the clip, or you can move. And again, this one's pretty clicky because I'm doing it with a sampler, but as you start experimenting, you might start to look at how you can even return back to this method for certain things that will feel like FM or feel like wavetable synthesis, but have their own character. Like you could add in a vocal sample and then start playing through the vocal sample to say words and control the rate at which the sentence is spoken. We can show some examples of that built into wavetable synthesizers in a little bit, but let's get started actually opening up a couple of wavetable synthesizers and looking at how the concept of wavetable synthesis has evolved over the years. For most of us, I would say our first introduction to a wavetable synthesizer was this sucker right here, our good friend Native Instruments Massive. This came out, I believe, in 2004. maybe 2008. It's in that 4-year range, I'm fairly certain. But this is where we all started, right? We have this collection of tables, and it starts to show you as you play through them how they evolve. You can see some of these are a bit more textural than others. Some of these are rather classic at this point. Memories. Where were you the first time you heard modern talking? But massive. What is massive? It is a 3-oscillator wavetable synthesizer that has 2 filters. It has this modulation oscillator for things like ring mod and phase mod. This is, as we talked about last week when we were talking about FM synthesis, most of these are in the same basic realm of audio rate modulation. Ring modulation is essentially frequency modulation applied to amplitude. Phase modulation is, as we talked about, just what we know as FM. When you were doing phase modulation, you're doing FM. What we just did inside of operator is FM, is phase modulation. Position right here, this is a bit special. This is going to be essentially frequency modulation on the position knob of the wavetable. And then finally, it has filter FM, which is frequency modulation applied not to the frequency of a oscillator, but to the cutoff frequency of a filter. Beyond that, Massive is kind of a special case in how it handles itself, but generally, when we're looking at wavetable synthesis, this is where we start. So let's make kind of a basic dubstep patch using Massive, just to show what people might get used to. I'm going to start by just going down to this LFO right here. I'm going to set this to a synced rate of 1/8. Let's set this to 140 BPM. Now let's drag this by clicking on this arrow this little arrow sign right here. Drag this over to the wavetable position. Now let's do the same thing to the cutoff here. Let's add in another oscillator an octave up using a different wavetable. Ooh, so let's do that in the opposite direction. I'm going to put the wavetable position now on the far end of the wavetable and move back. We're going to actually look at what's going on under the hood when we move on to the next wavetable synthesizer, the one that I think most of you are going to be familiar with. But Alright, so now we got this very nice kind of low wub. Let's maybe add in a little bit of, what were we saying? Phase modulation sounded good. That's nice. So let's grab another LFO. I'm going to set this to a saw wave. I'm going to have this be half the rate of LFO2. I'm going to set this to 1/2. Now this is constantly moving down over time. Attach this here. And And then this third one, I'm going to send out to just basically be a sub bass underneath everything. I'm going to set this to just a sine square wave shape. And to get the movement to match this filter, I'm going to set the amplifier down and move this up to max. So now we're getting a bit more of a body to this patch. We'll add a little bit of distortion to it. Maybe a different kind of distortion here with the hard clipper. Add maybe a little bit of the tube distortion just because it's dubstep. And then some dimension expander, and we're done. There's your 2010 Wubstep patch. What's the difference between a patch and a sample? That's a great question. So what we just built here is a synthesizer patch. We've taken different parameters and we've patched them together. That's what all of these modulations are starting to refer to. That's the patching together of these different things. You could also look at it as I'm moving this slider up or this slider down, I'm almost taking a cable, putting the cable out of this oscillator and plugging it into this filter. If I go over to this routing tab, you'll actually see how this whole thing works. Oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 are being routed through these different destinations. You can see the B is for a bypass on certain parameters. And they get routed into various places based on how you have things set up. This is the patch cable setup, in a sense. And right now, oscillators 1 and 2 are going into filter 1, which is on this low pass filter. This is where the filter 1 is going. This is being sent to insert 1, whereas the sub, this one right here, is being sent to filter 2 down here. You could say this is coming down like so. And it's not being processed until we get all the way to here, to the final effects routing. That's what this is for right here. That's what these two are doing. And that is sort of where we get this idea of patches. When we're talking about samples, what we're looking at is this right here. This is a sample of audio. It used to be, if you were here earlier, this used to be a MIDI clip, just like this massive patch we've been working on is based on. It used to be a synthesizer patch, but we rendered it into a waveform, which makes it into an audio sample. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's take a look at this and see what the patch looks like as a sample. This is our patch, and you can kind of see as we zoom in, there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of similarities here between how this waveform is evolving over the course of this longer shape right here, and this really short, quick shape. You can see that there's this modulation going on over time, and we've stacked different modulations. But even if I went back to the original massive patch, right? But let's turn off the filter. Let's turn off all of these extra processing patches that we've put on. I'm even going to turn off the phase modulation. And let's rebounce this audio file. If I turn this all off, print this down to audio, now it's starting to look way closer. That low pass filter was cutting out. It was subtracting frequencies so that we weren't dealing with this big long wash. But now you can really start to see how the wavetables are moving. You can see like the cycle right there starting to morph and become a very different shape. You can see kind of hints of it in the waveform as we move through the different parts of the sound. And these moments right here are really where wavetable synthesis comes into play. The whole point of a wavetable synthesizer is about movement. You can have a single cycle wave and use that for all of the other steps that we are dealing with, like all of the distortion, all of the filtering, the FM. That all comes in, but that's not really what makes wavetable synthesis. If you're building a wavetable just to have discrete points in it, that isn't as effective as, for example, having a waveform that shifts. So let's look at some other ways you can involve a wavetable synthesizer. So let's grab a trusty friend of ours that I'm sure most of you know. And that's our good friend Serum. Oh yeah, I gotta do this real quick. Hold on. Sorry. I literally reinstalled Serum for the first time in this reinstall of my computer OS for this lecture. For specifically this one, because I don't really use Serum anymore. I use something else, which I'll show you in a little bit. But I find Serum to be the most common form of wavetable synthesizer, which removed a lot of the features of Massive. As you can see, the effect matrix and the routing matrix is quite a bit different, and you don't have quite as many controls per oscillator, but the controls have also shifted. So as I move this wavetable position knob, you can see that this wave shape right here slowly starts to move between these different aspects of the sound. Let's find a better wavetable, something that has, yeah, there we go. This is exactly what I'm looking for. You can watch how I'm going through discrete stages of this wavetable. And if I stop at any one point, it's a static wave. But if, for example, I'm going to turn the volume off here so we don't have to hear this. If I put a LFO on this, and I just have it scroll from the bottom to the top, you can see that the wavetable is constantly moving, and there's all of these little details that emerge. So if I reset this, bypass this for a moment, each moment is pretty cool. You can make a patch out of that. I'm not saying you can't. But then, why didn't you just sample that one moment? And you can even do that in a wavetable synthesizer. I'll show you in a little bit. But what we really want is to reactivate that modulation. And you know, it sounds a little bit better when you have it actually making a shape. Add maybe a little bit of distortion to it. Maybe a little bit of OTT. And just like that, we have like 3 or 4 different tonal characteristics based on how long it spends at a particular point in the wavetable. And also whether you're going forwards or backwards through the table. Now, a lot of those are pretty crunchy and, you know, not super usable, but hopefully you can start to see how things are supposed to go. Big scare quotes around that. Huge, giant scare quotes around the idea that this is what you're supposed to do. But in terms of kind of the standard approach, this is where I would start. Trying to find, you know, a wave shape that works and... You can see even if you have a tiny, tiny fragment of the overall wavetable, that motion on its own is enough to make a good patch. But let's look at some of the other common tropes in wavetable synthesizers. Now, Massive has this as well, but the reason why I didn't show this off in Massive is because you don't get to visually see what's going on. And the big improvement that Serum made over Massive was this great view, which is available in both this 2D view and this 3D view. But we also have this one, which is going to be our warping mode. Warp modes are a secondary level of modulation that applies to whatever specific frame of the wavetable we are on. If I set this to bend plus, for example, right now, nothing is happening. But as I increase the bend plus mode, watch this waveform. Did you see how this peak right here started pushing in closer? Almost like we're pinching together the waveform. If I move this one down to bend minus, it's like we're doing the opposite direction. We're stretching apart the waveform based on where we're currently at, even while it's moving through the wave cycles. So these warp modes are a great way to add on additional motion to a sound. Let's maybe do the same modulation onto the bend mode here. So compare that to the original version. Original's pretty cool, pretty cool. Let's put back on the warp mode. It has all this extra motion. And you could even, like we did with Massive, use multiple modulations to create more of a evocative sound. You have this kind of bwah, bwee, bwah, bwee, bwah, bwee kind of back and forth motion. And additionally, it has one of the most popular bend modes, which is frequency modulation. Like I said, a lot of wavetable synthesizers start to pull in. Even Massive technically was borrowing from FM synthesis, was borrowing from subtractive synthesis with its filters and with FM. So now let's turn the volume down on oscillator B and turn it on. All right, so let's turn off these modulators just so we can hear what's going on. You won't be able to see what's happening, at least on Serum, but we'll show you sort of what's going on under the hood as soon as we move on to the next example of wavetable synthesis. So with this saw wave, we're hearing that oscillator sync effect, which we talked about during FM synthesis last week. Lot of crazy tones there. Let's maybe try modulating that FM. As you can see, hopefully, while we get closer and closer to a more complex starting waveform, notice how here, when we really basically just have a kind of bent, kind of broken sine wave in a sense, we get a pretty reasonable sound with FM. Obviously, there's a point where any FM is going to go crazy, but That doesn't sound too awful. Watch what happens when I move this over to a more harmonically complex waveform like this, where you see we have all these little spikes and bumps. It's much less of a sine wave in this moment. It gets much more noisy, it gets much more aggressive. Because, like I mentioned with the FM tutorial last week, the more complex the waveform, the more aggressively it reacts to FM, the quicker it turns to noise. So generally, if you're going to be doing a lot of FM with wavetable synthesis, keep the FM gentle with a clean waveform if you have a fairly harmonically complex wavetable. Now you're just getting little whips of noise at the end of the waveform. Or kind of swap this. One thing that I've seen quite a bit, like if I initialize this preset, let's just set this to a basic shape of a sine wave. Turn this on, and let's just go pick a wavetable, and FM from the wavetable. It sounds a lot like we're actually playing the wavetable, but it's coming from this instead. And that allows you to have a little bit more harmonic complexity in the waveform because the two waveforms are interacting rather than having a single wavetable or a single static piece of FM. You have this dynamically changing frequency modulation source. So that can be used, for more complex automations and modulations, for more complex patches. And even in Serum, you have all the same properties that you had with Massive in terms of sculpting these sounds. Give this a little bit more distortion, maybe a little bit of OTT, maybe a tiny, tiny bit of reverb. Get all these nice tones. We add a phaser that comes on. Pretty cool, right? We have access to the matrix, similar to that routing stuff, all those little modulations we have in Massive. You can connect them here or just kind of click and drag through this. And, you know, it totally makes sense why people love Serum. It has so many capabilities to it. It has a really clean and visual interface. It's fast. It's lightning fast. If you want to get a good patch in Serum, it doesn't take a lot of effort. Massive, you can make a cool sound, but to make a really usable patch, it requires a fair bit of post-processing. And Serum, you generally don't need a ton of post-processing because the sound itself is already pretty good. But there are some things that might not be optimal, or at least things that could be done differently. Doesn't make Massive or Serum any less usable, but let's look at some variations on this concept. Now, for the rest of this, we're going to be using one specific synthesizer called Phase Plant, but hopefully you can kind of see where we've been going. So if you have your own FM synthesizer, your own wavetable synthesizer that's not Phase Plant, you can still follow along with the information we're going to cover. So the thing I like about Phase Plant is that it does everything that these previous wavetable synthesizers do, but it's completely modular. You get to build from the ground up every part of your patch. When you looked at Massive, Massive had all of these windows. It was so visually cluttered. Serum streamlined a lot of that, but still very visually cluttered. With Phase Plant, you start off with this very clean, open slate. I can go in, I can add a wavetable oscillator, and I get access to a lot of the same features that I would have in Serum, for example. You can see we have all of these wavetables here. I even have some other wavetables kind of custom given to me, and the full factory library. So let's start with a nice growl table. A lot of these, like I mentioned, were made by Glortglunk. So let's add an LFO here. So far we're there. Now, what if I wanted to do warp modes? Because both Massive and Serum have warp modes. I don't see a warp mode trigger or option or button anywhere here. I'm not quite sure how I would do that. Well, here is something that hopefully is going to blow your mind. How's it going, CBEC? Let's grab another wavetable. And in this wavetable menu, we'll go up one to this category called modulators. How's it going, Wood? Now, see how this says bend, PWM, window, asym. If we look at Serum, those look fairly similar. We went through a lot of these same modes. Well, turns out those modulators, those warp modes that we are all used to using in Serum and Massive and stuff, they are themselves just wavetables. They are the same exact thing. The only difference is you're doing some very gentle phase modulation to these source tables. You could look at this as if I had Serum open. I wish I had not closed it, but let's just grab that real quick. You can look at Serum as having two possibilities for FM. You have this list of tables. All of these are FM tables. All of these are essentially just wavetables that you're FMing from. And then this is just saying, well, make your own FM. Make your own out of this. Do your own thing right here. That's how you're going to do your bend modes. And you could also attach that to the amplitude and stuff like that. But in Phase Plant, they just remove that middleman, and you have to do it yourself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this wavetable on Bend Soft. I have it set to the middle wavetable because the bend modes, most of these modes, are built with a plus-minus scale inside, whereas with Serum, you actually have to deliberately select the mode that is going to be plus and minus. You can kind of see how that's affecting this table right here. Whereas if I just go to button plus, it just goes one direction. If I go to bend minus, it goes in the other direction. I actually recommend, if you have not done this already, use all of these warp modes on a saw wave, because it will show you very viscerally what's happening to the waveform. And that'll give you an idea of what's going to happen. But you actually don't have to worry about that, because you can also just watch this table. I'm going to click this green button to open the audio rate modulation. I'm going to set it to a phase modulation of about 20 or so %. It doesn't have to be this exactly. The more you go, the more aggressive the effect. I think Serum is around 20% phase modulation. But now, you know, it live animates as you do it. You can get some really nice motion out of that. So let's set this back to 128, which is right there at the middle, and then add a little bit more modulation here. So pretty quickly, we're starting to get a really cool textured sound. And part of the benefits of having this type of setup, part of the reasons why I personally like Phase Plant over Serum, is I can also just hear the modulators. If you ever wanted to know what bend mode sounded like, what asym sounded like, here's your chance. And you can also FM the modulator tables. which is pretty nice. It allows you to add additional layers of modulation here. For a lot of kind of really cool intermodulations, right? So that is what I would consider the ground level of wavetable synthesis. If you were just looking to know how wavetable synthesis works, you can stop watching now, but we're going to start going into a lot more of what I would consider the corner cases, the fringe cases, things like how to import your own wavetables, how to possibly create new wavetables from older patches, and things that I would consider maybe best practices for doing wavetable synthesis. So if I am trying to come up with wavetables, with wavetable synthesis, because you have this sequence of frames from the start to the end, and they're all considered discrete, independent wave cycles, you can actually go look at the wave file that controls these different things. What I want to do is actually show you these tables. So if I go to my computer library, I go to audio, presets, kilohertz. Am I at the wrong one? I am in the wrong one. Down here. Audio, presets, kilohertz, and then down here under phase plant, you should have, wait, where is it? Am I in the wrong folder again? Here's the user wavetables level. I'll just use these for now. But if I go through here, you can see all of these wavetables exist as wave files. That's what the wavetable sounds like as you import it. If I pull this in here, you can even start to see what is going on. We can see these individual moments of change throughout the wavetable. The reason why I'm pointing this out is no two cycles are perfectly identical. If I zoom in on this zero crossing right here, that's different from this zero crossing right here. That's different from this zero crossing right here. So there's constantly this small little bit of change, and most importantly, it does not come back to the original shape. You don't want to repeat shapes. So let's build a wavetable, right? I'm gonna go use operator because I feel like operator is pretty good. Let's grab this. I'm going to put another F0 note down here just because F0, it's one that most people are comfortable with. I think people are familiar with kind of this specific way of importing. I think a lot of people end up doing their sound design here because F is like a super nice bass note. And let's just figure out how this patch is going to move. I'm going to use 2 bars so that this can be about a 3.5-4 second clip. I'm going to add maybe a couple of harmonics to this. Now, let's just start by moving this from low to high and seeing how that sounds. Cool. All right, now I'm going to do a little bit more modulation. I'm actually going to have this come down over time. That's really nice. It's too squelchy at the kind of middle point, so I'm going to smooth this out. Maybe a little bit more aggressively. I really like that. Now, For a couple of important best practices, I want to encourage you to avoid post-processing sounds like this that involve messing with the phase of the signal. If you have a lot of unison, if you have chorus, if you have a phaser, or you're doing any sort of detuning at all, you need to tread with caution when building your wavetables. The Glork class will explain this in more detail, but in essence, one of the hallmarks of a good wavetable versus a bad wavetable is how these zero crossings change over time. So for example, if I go back to a new patch, grab a wavetable in phase plant, and let's just use this one right here. Keep an eye on this zero crossing and this zero crossing. Notice how it generally stays in the same spot. Nothing really seems to be moving except for it moving kind of vertically up and down. Let's look at what maybe a less good table might look like. Let's see if I can find one. Yeah, this will actually be perfect because the massive X wavetables actually have a lot of this happening. Let's grab Dirty Vowel. Now, do you see how the wavetable is not only moving up and down, but look at this point right here. Follow this point right here. Notice how it's moving left to right. The wavetable seems to be shifting over time as you move, right? That is what happens if you have too much stereo or if you have too much phase incoherence. Even when it's imported the correct pitch, the phase of the sample is moving over time. So you will get less clean results when modulating. So anything that I want to add to this has to maintain phase coherence in a very broad sense. I'm going to use a, let's see, I'm going to use a distortion here. Let's put this on Wave Shaper, make this a little bit more aggressive. And then let's try one more thing. I want to be careful with this because I don't want to mess with the phase too much. Let's try a comb filter. This is risky. I will say this might be risky, so I'm going to print two versions of this. So let me just have this change over time. I'll have it come up then down. That's a really cool table. Let's print this twice. I'm going to print it once with the comb filter on because I want to be able to see how it moves. And then I want to do one without the comb filter to see if that changes anything. So we'll take both of these. I'm going to now consolidate them so that they will be normalized to max volume. And you can already start to see what's happening to this wavetable. You can see there's like this beginning moment that quickly starts to pinch together and grow into this repeating shape that gets more and more aggressive over time. And we're never moving back towards something. We're always moving towards our goal. If I was in Serum, this is where I would just go in and either on this window right here or in the actual oscillator table editor, I would go in, I would grab this, and then I would just do, typically I just do constant frame size, pitch, average. Otherwise, I'll do the 1024 or 2048 fast Fourier transform sequence. If you're in Serum, you can also just enter in F0, and that will give you the correct pitch and it'll just import properly like so. See, the table's right there. See how there is no real movement of it to the left and to the right? Everything is all maintaining its same basic position. The only thing to really check here is like how different are the tables. See, if these two are the same shape, that's how you know the waveform is imported the wrong pitch. But each click through of this gives us a slightly different shape. You can see how it evolves over time. And if we go down here, put on a little LFO here, do a little bit more FM. And now we're Virtual Riot, right? You could do more with this. Whenever you're doing a wavetable editor, it's good to do things such as normalize the different wavetables so that it maintains its volume. A little bit of crossfading never hurts. Compare that to before. It's a little bit kind of almost imperceptibly to me, so I wouldn't really worry about it because this was already a fairly clean wavetable. But like little things like that can often help smooth out the wavetable, make it a bit more cohesive, and just like that, you know, you have something usable. Has a lot of kind of options. You can hear that area is probably where we have the most kind of problematic elements. So there must have been something around this part of the process that got a little bit too wobbly. If I go back to the original source sample, for example, it makes sense because that's what you can hear. There's this kind of effect from the lower octave, this one right here, this chorus 05. That started to create almost like some pitch warble effect. So going forwards, now we have something to work with. Maybe we wouldn't want to have this at 0.5, an octave below our playing pitch. Maybe we want to have it at our playing pitch because we're dealing with a sub-bass level patch. If you're using a higher octave patch, something that might have more overtones, you could probably get away with it. But in phase plant, the process is essentially the same way. You just go in, you click on this. I don't think there is a great way of just importing the wavetable here. I don't think you can just do, oh, you can, never mind. Let's just go in, let's drag this in. As you can see, it properly detected the pitch. You can see it has different types of phase alignment. You can see with no phase alignment, it will sort of just scan through the sample with maybe a little bit of correlation. Let's just do base correlation, save that as a wavetable, and now, oops, if we turn this on, you can actually hear a little bit of almost phasing there at the top end. You hear that kind of effect. That's actually the comb filter, now that I'm realizing it. That's the sound of the comb filter moving. But we can do plenty of stuff with that. Maybe like FM that with a sine wave. Ooh, that's nice. Maybe use a higher octave. Maybe a little bit gentler. See how much farther we can push it with this cleaner part of the waveform than the more aggressive part? And another thing I guess is important to talk about with wavetable synthesis is the way that the different wave cycles can interact. Like, for example, if I want this to be a little bit smoother, I could maybe set some keyframes here and start processing it. Like, what if I was supposed to do a little bit of, let's try doing some disperser to this half of the waveform. You can see on Phase Plant, it's slightly different from the way it works in Serum. Phase Plant tends to use a keyframe-based approach for modulations, where you have like the starting keyframe, the ending keyframe, and you can create certain points within that where this will change. Like here I have a mount at 50. Here I'll set a mount to 75 or so. Back here it sets back to 50. So as we scan through, you can see the amount grows and then shrinks, and that will affect how the wavetable sounds. Compare that to what it sounded like before. Oops, let's turn this back. Sounds very slightly different as you go through that. And when you are re-importing, especially for Serum, it's quite a lot easier. You can draw in your own wavetables. Like if I just load up a wavetable right here, you can even go in and just start drawing your own shapes. And say like, go here, I want the shape to look more like this. And it'll keep track of all these changes as you go. You can kind of see where the waveform is headed. Set this to just. And now, as I move through, you can see it's morphing between the shapes I've drawn. Now, this is going to be pretty ugly. This isn't what I would consider necessarily the best shape. But, you know, let's see what it sounds like. Maybe actually normalize it first. Normalize frame peak, go, and then maybe align the fundamentals as well. A little bit of FM. Oh yeah, that's a nice crunchy wavetable. That took me relatively small amount of time, right? But I mentioned before, it's generally not a good idea to have like steppy wavetables, but you can definitely create your own sort of like a group wavetables. So let's say I only want small moments from this wave cycle right here to show up in Serum. I'm going to make a new patch. I'm going to keep this open for a second. I'm going to jump in here and let's just create our own cycles. So I'm going to take this as a wave cycle, consolidate this to a new file, maybe even add a little bit of a fade to the beginnings and the ends just to make sure this has a zero crossing. I'm going to look for a different shape. Let's try this shape right here, and I want it to be similar to the first one that I made. So I'll pull this back here. We're basically kind of making our own wavetable from scratch. You can start to see where the shape begins and ends. So I'm going to move this over to here. It's about the same spot. I'm going to take this and then cut right on that zero crossing right there. Back. This in a little bit. And as you can see, now we have two different tables, and I can keep going. I'm going to go grab one more from like closer to the end just so this could be more visual. Put this right here, and let's just try and find something that will allow us to work with it. This isn't going to be perfect in any stretch of the imagination, but the idea is we want the same length of time for each sample. This is about the same length of time as this sample. We can even tighten this in to get it to be exact, like that. Add a little bit of a fade on either side. And now this is where the steppiness comes in. Because you can take this and actually fill it in with all of your own ideas as individual cycles. First we drag it here, but what if I just drag it down here? It just imports that as a single cycle wave. I could go down to Serum. There you go. Now I'll go in, grab this other wavetable, drag it right next to it. Drag this table right next to it. Now, notice. You hear how there's like all of those individual little moments as we move through? That is one of the downsides of using a what we could call a wave cycle table rather than a wave table. Because in this, at a single discrete moment, we have a sound. But now we have all those kind of clicky moments. It's not as usable. So if you really wanted these shapes, you could just load that into a sampler like we did at the start. I could take this shape right here, load it onto this track to load it into a sampler, loop it. I'm gonna set this to 99 just so that we have a little bit more room to work with. And now, it works just as well and requires much less CPU and processing power to get it to sound good. So in general, I would recommend avoiding this. If you are going to do something like this, maybe consider doing some crossfading between the tables so it sounds a little bit more like this. That sounds much more usable because those cycles have become part of a broader modulation. And I think that will work out a lot better. So you can use single cycles. I don't want to discourage you from using single cycles. Just consider using single cycles to create a larger waveform, if that makes sense. Obviously, this whole thing was focused on basses, and that's because one of the things I've noticed with wavetable synthesis in particular is the more modulation you have on leads and melodic elements, the less consistent it sounds, the less clear the sound becomes, because you're stacking layers of complexity on a single sound rather than stacking layers of complexity across multiple sounds working together. The most clear example of this is the difference between an arpeggiator patch and a pad. So let's make two of those. So far, we've just been using basses. Now let's take this idea and make a pad out of it. So how would we make this into a pad? Well, instead of having a really fast modulation, let's have some really slow modulation that goes over the entire length of the file. Those sustained notes now have a lot of motion to them, a lot of control that we can exert over that to really create a textural thing. That's what I would say is the modus operandi, the guiding principle of wavetable synthesis is motion through texture. And motion through texture often does not work with motion through pitch or motion through harmony. So let's keep building this. Have a little bit of unison here. Let's start adding in another wavetable. Let's use a modulator to give this some bend modes. Let's grab a different LFO, set this to 128, and just kind of get this nice back and forth modulation going on. Now, this sounds pretty cool in my opinion. I would say this is a very interesting sound. It's a little bit noisy at times. You could probably clean that up. You could probably keep it a bit more low passed. Then maybe do like a little bit of gentle FM on that filter cutoff just to give it more timbre. I like that high pitch moment. You hear that at the end? That's so cool. So clearly it's not just for basses, but watch what happens when I move this attack up and I start doing the same thing with a pluck. Let's actually add an envelope to this to make it go. So. So all of a sudden we have a lot less kind of interesting motion going on. Part of that is because we have these LFOs set to re-trigger. Every time I play a new note, it's going to restart the modulation. Let's turn that off and see what happens. Now, for this example, I think it's doing a decent job, but there are moments where, to me, it starts to lose its perception. And if I had maybe more motion on here, all of a sudden it gets very farty. It gets really indeterminate in sort of where it's wanting to go, or at least in the way that I hear it. So I tend to steer away from a lot of modulation of texture on more melodic things, especially things that are like a lot more kind of lyrical in nature. And if I was, say, doing something with a really crunchy chord, that sounded really weird. Yeah, very crunchy, very weird. And even at a slower modulation, I feel like we're getting to that weird moment of texture and harmony coming and butting heads with each other. And they're both trying to take dominance over each other as the coolest thing happening. And if everyone's trying to be cool, then you're not really going to have any one thing to stand out as the coolest thing, which is generally what people are looking for. Looking for that one thing. It's like, oh man, you remember that bass line? That bass line was so cool. Or, oh, that pad was so wild. Or, oh, that melody, I can't get that melody out of my head. Very rarely, like, man, I love how the chord progression interacted with that bass patch. That's usually not what people are intending when they praise your song. So that, I think will do it for this video. Keep in mind that you can use this process generatively. You can repeat this. You can make a patch, then print that patch out as a sequence of modulations, Rather than having this go from the start to the end, you could just switch this to like a ramp up or a ramp down, aka a saw wave, just something that moves from the start of the waveform to the start of the patch to the end, and then import that as a wavetable and do the whole process over again. Obviously, the more you resample, the less you're going to want to process per sample. That's a big reason why I don't have a ton of post-processing on these sounds. And keep in mind, even with minimal post-processing on almost all of these sounds, in each case we got something usable. In each case we got something that you could probably put into a track and just EQ. That's the whole point of wavetable stuff, is it removes a lot of this extra work. With subtractive synthesis, you have to add a lot of phasers and a lot of EQs and a lot of filters and a lot of post-processing. With FM, you get these really cool tones, but you got to sculpt them and you got to modulate them to make sure that they work. You got to automate them over time. With a wavetable, you're basically just playing with a sample, and you just move the sample back and forth. And since the sample already has a lot of interesting motion in it, your job's half done. So I really hope that this has demystified the process. If you're watching this on YouTube, thanks so much for watching. Please be sure to give it a like, a comment, a subscribe, hit the bell thing. I will be uploading more YouTube videos soon. Please follow me on Twitch and Twitter. Please support me on Patreon if you feel like it. And yeah, thank you so much. And this is where we cut the video.